welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how you can heat emboss using any kind of water-based dye ink. This is such a neat technique, and there are a few different ways I'm going to share how you can do this. And this video is because of many of you who left wonderful comments on my last video in which I demonstrated how I create a winter sky and snowbanks. I featured the In the Pine stamp set and the Mary Moose stamp set. That card was so much fun to make. And I had lots of people comment when they saw me heat embossing with dye inks that they didn't realize you can do that. So I thought, that's gonna be my next video for you guys because there's a few different ways you can do this. It is so cool. So without further ado, let's get stamping. Okay, so I have gone ahead and pre-cut my cardstock. This is Blackberry Bliss. It measures 8.5 by 5.5. And this has been run through my die cut and emboss machine using the hammered metal embossing folder, which is a really neat embossing folder. Next, I have a piece of rich raspberry, and this piece of cardstock measures 3 3/4 by 5, and then a piece of Whisper White that measures 3.5 by 4 3/4. So I'm going to demonstrate a few cards using the heat embossing with dye inks, using all the same measurements. Alrighty, I'm bringing in a beautiful stamp set, beautiful friendship. Now there are a few different ways that you can emboss using your dye inks. So I'm going to show you each way. The first way I'm going to use is the way I did it in my last card in my previous video. So I'm taking my rich raspberry ink, and I'm going to take some blackberry ink as well, and some garden green. Okay, the first thing I'm doing is I'm taking my anti-static embossing buddy and going over the whole piece of Whisper White cardstock. Then, and this is just stained, there's nothing wrong with the stamp, it's not inked, it's just stained. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my Versamark ink pad and I am going to dab over this entire image. And I always like to stamp on this mat when I'm using my photopolymer. Just gives it a little extra cushion when you're stamping. So once this has been inked up with the Versamark, I'm going to bring in my rich raspberry ink pad, and I'm going right into that ink pad. And I'm just going to stamp it right down in the corner here. Now, you don't want to go back in your Versamark after just going into your dye ink with that color. I did have some questions in my last video about that. I cleaned my stamp every time before I went back into my Versamark. But I'm not going to restamp with this. But if you do want to use the same image, clean it, go into your Versamark, ink it up again, and then make sure you clean it again. Otherwise, you're going to be pulling in that dye ink into your Versamark, which would be a bad thing. Okay, I'm going to get some clear embossing powder, and I'm just going to sprinkle it on. I still can't find my spoon for this. I know I've got a spoon somewhere. But look at the clear embossing powder, it sticks perfectly. So now I have that beautiful shine to my flower. So I'm going to do the same thing using the leaves. I absolutely love this stamp set. And even though I'm still in full Christmas mode, I must say it's quite nice to be stamping a non-Christmas card just for a little change. So I have the leaves. Again, go back into my Versamark. And I'm going to use garden green. I'm going to stamp some leaves here. Now I do want to reuse this, so I'm just going to clean it. I'm just going to use this Stamp and Scrub because I do love the Stamp and Scrub. And I'm going to spray on some of our Stampin' Mist, and then clean it on the one side and dry it on the other side. I have loved this ever since I've been a demonstrator, and when they start getting where they're not cleaning your stamps, these just pop out, and then you clean them underneath your kitchen tap. and then just stand them to dry in like a dish rack and pop them back in. So I really do like that. Okay, so I am going back into my Versamark. Let's move this in so you guys can see. And into my Garden Green again. I'm going to stamp these ones up here. And I'm going to bring in a different leaf this time just to have a little variety. And add one more right here. Okay. Clear powder. And set that with the heat tool. And there we go, glossy, pretty, all embossed. Now, sentiment time. So I am going to use Blackberry Bliss to pull in the color of the card base. Okay, so I am going to ink Birthdays Are the Best Days in my Versamark and going into my Blackberry Bliss. I'm going to stamp it right down here. Clear embossing powder. And now everything I have just stamped is beautifully embossed. So I'm just going to go ahead and put this onto my Rich Razzleberry card mat. This is a very simple card, but there is nothing wrong with simple. And Cooper is outside barking at something. And put that onto my card base. And isn't that a pretty card? So nice. So I'm just putting a little piece of computer paper on the inside of my card. Sometimes I use Whisper White cardstock, but most of the time I just use computer paper that I cut down to measure 4 by 5 1/4, and then I save the Whisper White cardstock for the inside of my cards for kind of the extra special ones. But that's it. That is how easy it is to emboss with the dye inks. But I'm going to show you some other ways to do it. So for this card, instead of using Beautiful Friendship, I'm moving on to Beautiful World. And I am going to take out one of these circles, put it on my block, and I've got my anti-static on that piece of white. And I'm going into the Versamark, so same thing I did on the last card. And this card base is our Misty Moonlight. So let's start with the Misty Moonlight first. So again, just like the last card, and here's where it's going to get a little bit different. I am going to take my Shaded Spruce marker and go right on top of where the landmass is. And I'm not worrying about going into that blue because the green is darker than that blue, or at least part of that same family. And I'm just going right on top. And if you have too much ink that you don't want, just blot it off, because there's a lot of that Misty Moonlight on this. So I'm just blotting it off so that I can get more of that green marker on there. You could also alternatively take your blending pen, and you can pick up the ink with your blender pen and then swipe it off and then go in with your marker too. But I'm just going to do it this way. I'm going to stamp it right here. So see how I've got the two colors. Bring in my clear embossing powder. And set that with the heat tool. So that's a really cool way using your markers, and you can heat emboss your markers too. So now I'm taking in the stand for what is going to be my globe, going into my Versamark. And you know what? Let's stick with these in colors. I'm going to use Cinnamon Cider. And try my best to line this up and keep it straight. Not my forte. See? My globe is rising from that. That's all right. I have an idea. I took my shaded spruce marker just because it's here and it's handy. And I'm just going to draw a line down so that it's almost like it's a pin. So it's going to be spinning on the pin. I don't know. Try to make it work because I don't want to redo the card. It's balmy blue. Okay, so I'm going to pick up some ink with my water painter. And I'm just going to add like a little shadow down below because I don't want this to look like it's just floating in mid-space. So that kind of grounds it, I think. Now, I want to stamp my sentiment. I'm going to stamp Life is a Beautiful Journey. Go into my Versamark. And this time I'm going to go into my Balmy Blue. And I'm going to kind of just dip the top edge and the bottom edge into that Misty Moonlight and stamp it down like so. So then I get the two colors. Really gotta find my spoon for this embossing powder. And then heat it up. So that is a really fun way to get multiple colors before you emboss them. Okay, so somehow I got ink on my fingers and I now have ink on my card. My first thought was, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to start over. And then I'm like, no, I don't want to start over. So I'm gonna try something. I have a piece of Stampin' Sponge and I'm gonna take my cinnamon cider and just dab this off. And I'm just going to randomly dab around and hope that this is not going to look bad. And I got two ink marks here. Okay. And then I'm just going to go around the edge. And I kind of wanted to keep some white in there. I don't want to cover all that white. So that's how I fixed my ink blotch. Okay, so for this card, I'm going to use Seaside Notions. And again, the measurements for the card are all the same. I have also run this through the Seabed embossing folder. Most of it's going to get hidden, but it's still going to look pretty to have a little border with the embossed showing. Okay, now let's see what we want to stamp. Seahorse, definitely, because I love the seahorse. And I don't know yet. We'll figure it out. I just want to show you how you can do this with the Stamparatus. So we have taken our embossing buddy, and I'm going to put this on my Stamparatus. I like to line it up with this notch here for some reason. I don't tend to put this into the corner too often. I don't know. That's just me. And take my magnet, put her down, and I am going to stamp my seahorse right there. Okay. Now, before I go into my Versamark, I am going to go into my ink pad. So I'm going to use Flirty Flamingo. Let's just put that ink pad underneath so I've got something to stamp on here. So I am inking my stamp with the Flirty Flamingo. Then I'm going right onto my cardstock. Then I'm going to clean this. So I am just using a baby wipe because I don't want to take my stamp off the plate. I want to keep it in the exact same place. Now, we do have our handy dandy scrubber thingies. Mine is pretty hard. So these would work. I just didn't put it underneath the tap to get it wet for this video, but those are great too. You could use that instead of a baby wipe when you have a stamp on your plate. Now what I'm going to do is take my Versamark, go on top of the seahorse, and guess what? It's going to go right on top of that Flirty Flamingo perfectly. Emboss it. Okay, so I'm going to put this back in here. And for this one, I'm going to do Thinking of You. Figure out where I want that. I'll just do it there. Pick it up. And this time I'm going to stamp with Melon Mambo. So I'm just sticking with the colors of the cardstock. And the neat thing about using your Stamparatus is you can stamp it with your dye ink a few different times to get it as dark as you want. So clean that off. And now I'm going in with my Versamark. So you always want to make sure your stamps are cleaned. You have no dye ink on them before you go into your Versamark, because I know some people have questions about that. Sprinkle on my clear embossing powder. I'm going to leave it at that for the heat embossing and just quickly try to finish this card. Simple but pretty, and perfect for those of you who are new to stamping and you may not have a whole lot of supplies. You can get a lot of mileage just by having a clear embossing powder, the Versamark, a couple of ink pads, and then if you wanted to add either the water painters or a blender pen, you can do that. And then of course, you know, if you want some shimmer, clear wink of Stella. But that's it. Easy. One more card. You probably thought I was finished demonstrating with this stamp set, didn't you? No, I'm still loving it. One of my very, very favorite bundles from the current mini catalog, and of course it's got the dies to go along with the leaves. Love this stamp set so much. Could be because it's leaves. As I mentioned in my last video, I love leaves. So, Whisper White, wiped it with the embossing buddy. And I am going to show you a technique that I have always loved that will work really well with the heat embossing and dye inks. So again, photopolymer, so I'm bringing in my Malpaya there and a block. I'm actually going to show you two different things because my mind is just spinning with ideas right now. All right, so I'm going back to the first way where I ink it with Versamark first, and again the stamps are just dyed from being so well loved. Then I'm going in with crumb cake because my card base is crumb cake and my card layer is early espresso. Now I'm pulling in my markers and I'm going to take some Poppy Parade and I'm just tapping. Now this is called the thumping technique. It's an oldie, but it's a goodie. So I'm just tapping on some Poppy Parade. Let's go with, what's this? Mossy Metal. Yeah. And I'm using the bold tip. And again, just tap, 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 like you're playing a drum. Okay. Just stamp this down here. And you can see, hopefully, the different colors that I have in there from adding the marker. So now what I'm going to do is take my embossing powder and heat emboss that. Can you see how cool that looks with the different colors? And you've got the shine from the embossing powder. I'm going to do the exact same thing. Versamark. Crumb cake. Tap on some Poppy Parade. And then tap on some Mossy Metal. This is where it gets radical, my friends. I'm bringing in some water. Let's move that out of the way. And I'm going to lightly mist this stamp with water. Whoa. And then I'm going to stamp this down. Eek, I don't know where. Like that. Okay. So then the colors kind of muddle. And you know, you don't even really need, well, you really just don't need Versamark if you're going to be spritzing with water, because that's still going to be wet. The paper will be wet, so that will hold the embossing powder. So there's yet another way you can emboss with dye ink. And because I like to work in threes, I'm going to stamp again Versamark. You know what? This time I'm going to use Poppy Parade. Mossy Metal. And I'm going to pull in my early espresso marker. And just thump that on. And I'm going to mist this one again. And because I missed it over my paper, I got splatters, but that's okay. I love that. That's a very happy accident in my opinion. Ooh, and that was a lot of water. That's all right. Embossing powder. Now I'm going to stamp Your Friendship is Something I Know I Can Count On. Versamark. And because that has so much red in it, I am going to use that for inking. And I'm also going to pull in some early espresso. So I'm going to go over the word friendship. So just like the other card that I did. And count on. So let's do a recap of the cards. This is the first one I did, my favorite from today. Then I think it was this one that we did, where I used the markers and then stamped on the stamp image with the 2 different ink pads. Then the Seaside Notions. So not only is it embossed, but I actually colored inside the embossed lines as well. And then the last one where I incorporated the thumping technique and a little bit of water, but I just wanted a variety of different things that you can do with your ink pads and emboss them in clear embossing powder. So I hope you have fun embossing with your dye inks. I hope you enjoyed today's demonstration. And again, this is a very, very simple card layout, but I think it's a great layout, not just for people who are new to stamping, but those of us who need a fast layout when we're making our cards. So thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you. Happy stamping!